Good morning. Everybody take your last hit of coffee and we'll get going this morning. We've got a fair amount to cover this morning, so we better go ahead and get going. The other Bible class teachers are starting to tease me that I'm not going to make it to Judges. The actual class description was Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. I didn't even bother putting Ruth on the slides. So we'll just see if at any point any of you notice when Judges disappears from the slides too. But welcome to week 5 of 13 weeks. So I should have time, but we lost a week, so we'll see how that goes. In our study of Joshua and Judges, we've titled this study Conquest and Consequences. And so we're talking primarily about the conquest in the southern region in the beginning part of Joshua. And if you look at the book of Joshua, you can really divide it into two pieces. You can divide it into the book of war, which is the first several chapters, about half of the book really, 12 chapters, and then the land division or the land distribution, which is the second half of the book. And so when we talk about the conquest, we're really talking about that first part of the book, those first 12 chapters primarily. But then even within the conquest, we're talking about two different functions that took place. One was as part of the promise of God to Abram that his descendants would return to this land and would then live in this land. And then an aspect of that promise was that the people who were in that land were going to be punished and removed from that land because of their sin. And so at least initially, the conquest is primarily about acting as God's justice. And so the people are not conquering these cities and moving into them. They are, in fact, just destroying these cities. And that's when we looked at Jericho a little bit last week, it was primarily a destruction that was going to take place. And the same with the city of Ai that we're going to look at today. It was a destruction, and then they were still operating out of their camp in Gilgal. And that will start to change here in a little while. Well, where they will start moving into the land, they will start occupying parts of the land. Whereas for right now, they're still operating out of Gilgal. Now, if you remember last week, we looked at, you may not have seen the title of the class because I have it on my paper and I don't put it on the slides, but it was looking at Rahab, Israel, and us. You guys remember we were looking at the choices that they made, the choices that Rahab made, the choices that Jericho and Israel made, and then the choices that we have made. And now we reminded ourselves, or we looked very closely at the fact that Rahab knew what God had done. This is how she made her decision. She knew what God had done. Remember, she tells the men who are in her house, she says, "We know what God did to Egypt. We know how he saved you and rescued his people out of Egypt and how he brought you to this land." So she knew what God had done. She then believed that God would do as he promised. She knew also that God had promised them this land and that he was going to give them this area that she currently lived in. And she believed that God would do as he promised. And so what decision did she make? What choice did she make? She chose to be on God's side. Right? She chose to be on God's side by doing what? By helping the spies, the messengers that Joshua had sent. But in reality, by putting all of her trust and her dependence on God. Because the only thing that she had was the symbol, the cord that she put out of the window, right? And so she is putting all of her trust on God that he would then do as he promised to her as well. Just in the same way that she believed he would do as he promised both for Israel and for Jericho, she believed that he would do as he promised to her. And the king of Jericho, of course, made the opposite choice. He also knew what God had done. But he did not believe then that God would do what he promised. He did not believe that God could fulfill his promises. And so his response to the truth of God was that he shut the gates tightly. You remember? He closed everything up. He wasn't willing to interact with God. He wasn't willing to believe that God was going to overcome his city. And so he shut the gates tight. And so that leads us to our memory verse, because both Rahab and Jericho made a choice But Rahab did what? She chose life. She chose life. Jericho, or particularly the king of Jericho, chose death. They chose destruction. So this is our memory verse, and we say it every week, and so let's say it together now. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your seed, by loving Yahweh your God, by listening to his voice, and by holding fast to him. The structure of this memory verse, the words that are here, is so very important, because as we move through Joshua and maybe Judges at some point, we are going to see the constant need for the people to listen to God, to put him first, to love him, to then listen to him, and to hold fast to him. That is their trust, their dependence, to hold fast to what God has told them, to what God has promised, to remember what God has done. That's really all the people have to do, and yet we're going to constantly see that this is where they fail. And of course, the point of this is to make these connections. Is this not also where we primarily fail? We do not listen to his voice. We do not put him first in love. And we don't hold fast to him. Now we're going to talk a little bit about the tail end of the destruction of Jericho, and then we're going to move on to the events directly after that. So let's remind ourselves that when God gave instructions to Joshua about what to do with Jericho, he gave very specific instructions about Jericho. And remember, we said that they resembled more of a religious ritual rather than a military tactic, right? Because it was all about you're going to have 7 priests and 7 trumpets, and you're going to march around over 7 days, and it's going to be once a day for 6 days, and then 7 times on the last day. And so it had this very specific ritual that was taking place around the destruction of Jericho, because Jericho had been what? It had been devoted to destruction. You remember that particular phrase, both Rahab used it and then Joshua used it. And it's a specific word that is translated as devoted to destruction, and it means ritual sacrifice. And so it is very much that Jericho and everything in Jericho, everything that belongs to Jericho and all the people of Jericho are going to be sacrificed before the living God. They are part of this ritual sacrifice because of their choices they have made, because of their sin. And of course, we remember, though, that Rahab then is the exception to that. So let's remind ourselves of what happens in Joshua 6, starting in verse 18. But as for you, now remember, this is the additional instruction that the people get when they are going to enter into Jericho. This is the additional instruction they get. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest you are devoting them. Excuse me. Sorry, I have a tooth that got worked on and it keeps tripping me up. Let's start that over. But as for you, only keep yourselves from the things devoted to destruction, lest as you are devoting them to destruction, you also take some of the things devoted to destruction and make the camp of Israel devoted to destruction and bring trouble on it. You've noticed I've underlined that too. I think you should do it as well. But all the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron are holy to Yahweh. They shall go into the treasury of Yahweh. So the people shouted, and the priests blew the trumpets. And when the people heard the sound of the trumpet, the people shouted with a great shout. And the wall fell down beneath itself, so that the people went up into the city, every man straight ahead, and they took the city. And they devoted to destruction everything in the city, both man and woman, young and old, and ox and sheep and donkey with the edge of the sword. And then skipping to verse 24, but they burned the city with fire and all that was in it. Only the silver and gold and articles of bronze and iron they put into the treasury of the house of Yahweh. And so the city is destroyed. They follow God's instructions to the letter. The walls come tumbling down, as the song says. They enter into the city. They destroy everything and everyone, and they burn the city to the ground. Now, I want to take just a moment, and we don't have a whole lot of time to jump through this, but I feel like this is important. I want to take a moment to show you some of the archaeological discoveries that have taken place around Jericho, because interestingly, we know where Jericho is, and so thus we can make some of these determinations about where these other places are, because for well over 100 years now, we have been aware of the location of Jericho. It has been discovered and it has been excavated numerous times, and so you can see the estimated position of where they crossed the Jordan. You can see the estimated position of Gilgal, and then the position of Jericho, and then further over to the west, the position of Ai. You can see those in relation to each other because the geography fits, and particularly because we have found and excavated the city of Jericho. Now, we have excavated it to the point, and I keep saying we, people, not me, I haven't been there. I'd love to, though. But people have excavated Jericho to the point where we actually have a good understanding of the size of the city and even its layout. And you can see that it's actually one of the oldest cities in the world. It's been there for an extended period of time. And at one point it was a smaller city and had an inner wall, and then it expanded and it has this outer wall. The size, the shape, all of these things of Jericho are known. You can see that we have discovered the walls, we have discovered residences. There were in fact residences attached to the wall. They weren't a part of the wall structure, but they were built onto the side of it, so you can recognize how Rahab's house would have still been standing when the wall came down. They have a spring of water that has been found, defensive positions. Everything about the city is pretty well known after it's been excavated, both in the early 1900s, the 1930s, and the 1950s. And because we know so much about the layout of it, we can actually concoct a fairly accurate, I think, rendering of what the city would have looked like, particularly from the ground level. So you can see the multiple areas where the walls are, the outer wall and the inner wall, and that embankment down at the bottom. This is what it would have looked like when Israel is marching around the city. So this isn't some ancient outpost that we can kind of think, what's the big deal? Mud and brick, it ain't that imposing a thing. This was a very imposing fortified structure that Israel then takes on to attack. And you remember a few weeks ago when we were talking about crossing the Jordan, we had a comment about the faith required to be the first one as the priest to put your feet into the water. You had to step into the rolling waters of the Jordan, and then the water pulled back. You had to take that step of faith. Imagine the faith now that Israel has to go up to an imposing city structure like this and then march around it, knowing that you have no possible way of breaking into this place. You have no way of actually destroying the city or conquering this city. But what has been discovered is the foundation wall, which if you noticed on that previous slide, you can see kind of that curved hump at the bottom and then the wall that extends up from that. That's the foundation wall that the mud brick walls would have been built upon. And this is an actual picture of one of the excavation trenches in Jericho. And this is the stone foundation wall upon which the mud brick walls would have been built. And so when Israel was marching around, they would have been marching around this brick or this stone foundation wall, looking up at the mud brick walls above them and wondering how in the world are we supposed to get through here, but of course trusting fully that God knows what he's doing and that God's going to be able to conquer the city, because they are what? They are fully passive in the destruction of the city, but fully active in their covenant relationship with God. And so this is that stone foundation wall. But when they excavated this, when they actually dug this trench, this is what they have discovered about it. They have discovered the collapsed mud brick structures all to the outside of the city, all collapsed down along the fascia of that stone foundation wall. They then discovered that everything had been maintained fairly well, particularly for a city of this age, because it had an abandonment layer. It had soil over the top of the city because it had been abandoned for so many years. And so because of that abandonment layer of soil, Everything had been preserved to a fairly good extent. And then underneath that abandonment layer, as they trenched down through the city, they discovered the destruction layer. And there weren't just like layer upon layer of, well, this city got destroyed, and then this city got destroyed, and this. No, there was one primary layer, and then there was a destruction layer. And in that destruction layer, it was actually a burned layer. And so they know for a fact that the city was burned, and then that after the city was burned, it was abandoned for such a long period of time that it was covered over with the soil. And so in the burned remains of the city, you can see that as the walls then fell outward, one, that never happens. The walls don't fall outward. They're designed not to fall outward. And if you're actually conquering a city and trying to break through the wall, you punch a hole through one particular spot, but you don't have the entire wall around the entire city fall down to the outside. But that's what they found. And not only did they find that, they found that it fell in such a way that it basically formed a ramp up over the stone brick foundation for the people to actually enter into the city. So all of this has been found, and within the burned city layer that they found pottery jars, full jars of grain. Do you remember that Israel took the city? They came into the promised land during the harvest time, right? It was during full harvest, and so in the burned layer of Jericho, they have found full jars of grain that have all been burned. And so we find this evidence, we find this proof that not only did the city get destroyed in the way the Bible describes, not only did the city get burned the way the Bible describes, we also see that Israel did not take anything belonging to the city. Because what you would have done in a normal geopolitical conflict, you would have gotten into the city, you would have seen all of the produce of their harvest, and you would have kept it for yourself. But that's not what God told them to do. He said, burn the city, take nothing that belongs to the city, and this is what has been found, the burned remains of full storage jars of grain in Jericho. And so I just wanted to take a moment to comment on this. Because while Jericho and the events surrounding Jericho are kind of one of the most fantastic elements of these stories, and we have children's songs about it. God said to Joseph, go to Jericho and march 7 times around, and the walls came tumbling down. It would be so easy to just kind of think, well, that's just a whole fantastical idea. But we have found the place, we've dug it up, we've got all of this evidence that it all happened exactly the way God said it, and even when the Bible says that it happens. And so we don't believe strictly because we have these kinds of evidences, but it's important for us to recognize that these things happened. These really happened. These are real people, real places, real events that the Bible is describing, and they happened exactly the way the Bible describes them as happening. And we can have that confidence in the veracity of the Scripture that we're reading. So there's our little archaeological corner. So moving on to Joshua 7, starting in verse 1, here's where everything starts to go wrong. Because that was so great, wasn't it? They obeyed God all the way through. They did all of the ritual. The walls came tumbling down. They entered into the city. They destroyed it. They did everything God commanded, except Joshua 7, verse 1, but the sons of Israel acted unfaithfully in regard to the things devoted to destruction. Notice how it says that. The sons of Israel acted, but who was it? Achan, the son of Carmi, the son of Zabdi, the son of Zerah, from the tribe of Judah, took some of the devoted things. Therefore the anger of Yahweh burned against the sons of Israel. Notice how it starts collective, goes specific, ends collective again. Verse 2, Now Joshua sent men from Jericho to Ai, which is near Beth-aven, east of Bethel, and said to them, Go up and spy out the land. So the men went up and spied out Ai. Then they returned to Joshua and said to him, Do not have all the people go up. Only about 2,000 or 3,000 men need go up to strike down Ai. Do not have all the people toil up there, for they are few. So about 3,000 men from the people went up there, but they fled from the men of Ai. And the men of Ai struck down about 36 of their men and pursued them from the gate as far as Shebarim, and struck them down on the descent, so that the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Not exactly a great second step after the destruction of Jericho. And so we have here, again, the actions of Joshua are very interesting. He once again sends out people to spy out the land. He did this with Jericho. He was a part of the group that initially did this when they went into the land of Canaan 40 years previously. But he sends these guys to look ahead. They then come back and they say, Ai is just a smaller town. And that's true. Ai was a smaller town. It wasn't a large fortified city like Jericho, but it was very strategically placed in that it overlooked the main path through the mountains that you would take to move west. And so it was necessary that Ai be conquered. It was necessary that Ai be destroyed, but also for the fact that they were part of the sinful group. They were part of the punishment and justice of God. But he says this is just a smaller city. We don't even need to fully commit to this action. Don't even send everybody. Just send the small cohort. We can take them out easily. We're going to overwhelm them, no problem. And we have no record of Joshua inquiring of God about this. We have no record of God telling him what to do about the city of Ai at this point. And we have no record of Joshua inquiring of God, what should we do next? Where should we go next? Instead, he sends out these men. They come back and report, hey, the city of Ai is right here. It's worth taking, and it's small. We can do this, no problem. Let's just send a small cohort of guys. And so what do we have? We have Joshua takes them at their word. And instead of inquiring of God about this, he simply sends the men to do it. Now, maybe erring on the side of caution, he sends the bigger number that the men say, send 2,000 or 3,000. Well, he sent 3,000, but it didn't really matter. They get routed by the warriors of Ai. They get chased down. 36 of them are killed. And so they were so confident after Jericho that God was on their side, that they don't even inquire of God. They don't ask, how are we supposed to do this? They just go up there and attack Ai, and then they suffer the consequences for their action. They have forgotten their responsibility. Their responsibility is to be fully active in their covenant relationship with God, and yet they have not bothered to check and see, are we still good? Are we still on God's side? No, instead they are fully confident that God is on their side, and then they have this failure. And so let's look at Joshua's response when all of this happens, this prayer that he offers up before God. 7 and verse 6. Then Joshua tore his clothes and fell to the earth on his face before the ark of Yahweh until the evening, both he and the elders of Israel, and they put dust on their heads. So they're in full mourning here. Joshua said, Alas, O Lord Yahweh, why did you ever bring this people over the Jordan, only to give us into the hands of the Amorites, to make us perish? If only we had been willing to live beyond the Jordan. O Lord, what can I say, since Israel has turned their back before their enemies? And the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land will hear of it, and they will surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what will you do for your great name? That doesn't sound very good, does it? That doesn't sound like Joshua. That doesn't sound like the man we've been built up to know. And Joshua's response here is misdirected. His response is misdirected. He is implicitly blaming God for their failure. He is basically accusing God of having brought them to this place and then abandoning them. Now, is that not word for word what God promised several times that he would not do? He said, I will not leave you. I will not abandon you. And that's what Joshua is basically accusing him of doing. Why did you bring us here? Why did you bring us over the Jordan? But then look at this phrase. Look at this idea. If only we had been willing to live beyond the Jordan. Who does that sound like? Sounds like the Israelites when they were saying what? Why'd you bring us out of Egypt? If only, let's go back to Egypt. Why did you bring us into this wilderness? Why did you bring us into this horrible place, God? Blaming God for their salvation. And he says, if only we had been willing to live beyond the Jordan. That sounds very similar to the way the people who were destroyed in the wandering sounded. But it's also flawed because staying behind at the Jordan was never an option. To refuse the promised land was not their prerogative. This was God's promise to Abram. This was going to be their fulfillment. Their duty, their task, was to be fully active in their covenant relationship with God. They weren't offered to stay on the other side of the Jordan. They were told, get up and cross over into the land that I have promised you. This wasn't even an option. But then he's moaning and he's complaining, if only we had done this thing. That wasn't even an option. That wasn't their choice to make. But Joshua should know this, and he should know by now that what happened was not a result of God failing them, but of them failing in their duty, in their responsibility. They have failed in their covenant relationship with God. He should know this. He has seen this happen time and again, and yet when he prays to God, he's shifting the blame over to God. And before we beat up on Joshua a little bit too much, how often do our own prayers sound like this? Do we ever find ourselves, if we ever stop and think about it, do we ever find ourselves falling prostrate before God, this physical position of submission, but then not actually repenting, and instead blaming God for whatever's happening in our lives? You see, they fall down before the ark. They fall down in submission. They fall down in mourning. They tear their clothes. They cover their heads in dirt. They're doing the whole physical process, but they aren't repenting. They're just blaming God. Why'd you bring us here and let this happen? As you can imagine, God's not too pleased about this. In verse 10, let's see what God's response is. So Yahweh said to Joshua, "Rise up! Why is it that you have fallen on your face? Israel has sinned, and they have also trespassed against my covenant which I commanded them, and they have even taken some of the things devoted to destruction, and have both stolen and dealt falsely." Stolen and dealt falsely, he says. Moreover, they have also put them among their own things. Therefore the sons of Israel cannot rise before their enemies. They turn their backs before their enemies, for they have become devoted to destruction. I will not be with you anymore unless you destroy the things devoted to destruction from your midst. And going to verse 15, and it will be that the one who is taken with all the things devoted to destruction shall be burned with fire, he and all that belongs to him, because he has trespassed against the covenant of Yahweh, and because he has committed a disgraceful thing in Israel. God tells Joshua, get up! Get up! Why are you prostrate before me when you aren't repenting? There is no point in this attitude of submission when you aren't actually submitting. Get up and do what you're supposed to do. Israel has broken covenant with God. They have acted unfaithfully. These words are usually reserved for a commentary between people. If a husband was unfaithful to his wife, that is what these terminologies are typically used for. But it's used for Israel. They have acted unfaithfully before God. And God says, I will not be with you anymore until you do what? Until you return to covenant relationship with me. You did what you weren't supposed to do. You stole. You lied. You must get back into covenant relationship with me. And Joshua should have known this. He was the one who gave them the instructions, the careful instructions. Do not take anything from the city, lest you be devoted to destruction like Jericho. He knew this. Joshua also knew that he hadn't been given any instructions by God. Yahweh speaks to Joshua whenever God wants to. And yet he was not told anything about the city of Ai. He wasn't given any instructions on what to do. Why then did Joshua not inquire of God? Why did Joshua not say, is everything okay? Can we proceed? How do you want us to proceed? He didn't inquire of God. And so just after God has established Joshua as this leader, he then fails in his leadership. And so after this, God gives them the instructions about how to find out who is responsible. And they go through this whole system of selection where people pass before God, and he says this group of people and then this group, and it keeps getting smaller and smaller, working its way down. And so Joshua and the people obey God in every detail, and they work through this systematic way all the way down until they identify Achan. They go through this whole process and they identify Achan. And Joshua says this. Then Joshua said to Achan, my son, I implore you, give glory to Yahweh, the God of Israel, and give praise to him, and declare to me now what you have done. Do not hide it from me. Now that might sound something like a strange phrase, and it might better be described as recognize God's authority and confess to him. Recognize that he is your righteous judge and confess to him. Tell us what you have done. So Achan answered Joshua and said, truly I have sinned against Yahweh, the God of Israel, and this is what I did. I saw among the spoil, you might underline that. It's going to come back to bite. I saw among the spoil a beautiful mantle from Shinar and 200 shekels of silver and a bar of gold, 50 shekels in weight. Then I coveted them and took them, and behold, they are concealed in the earth inside my tent with the silver underneath it. And so right out of the gates, we see the problem with Achan. We see the problem. You can say, well, yes, he coveted. He saw these things and he coveted. Yes, but what is his perspective about Jericho? What does he call it? He says, I looked among these spoil. I looked among the spoil and I coveted. There was no spoil in Jericho. That's the entire point. The city was devoted to destruction. All of it belonged to God. And yet Achan's mindset, Achan's perspective was that there was spoil. And so then he sees among what he thinks of as the spoil, he doesn't recognize it as God's possession, and he covets these things. And so he takes the illicit items, and then all of Achan's possessions and his children, no wife is mentioned, are taken out. They are stoned. Their remains are burned. All of his possessions are burned, including the items that he took. And then a great heap of stones is covered over him and all of his possessions that were burned. A great heap of stones is raised up as a memorial. A memorial to what? A memorial to God's justice, yes, but a memorial to their mistake. A memorial to their sin. A reminder, just as the big pile of stones after crossing the Jordan was to remind them of what God had done, this great heap of stones is raised up over Achan to remind them of what they've done and the consequences for leaving covenant relationship with God, the consequences for sinning. Now, during this entire process, it seems kind of strange that God works them through this systematic thing when God knows it's Achan. They're not figuring this thing out. God knows it's Achan, and they work their way down through this entire process. Why go through this whole process? Well, Achan is given a significant amount of time to confess. He is given time to repent. He is given time to come forward. And yet he chooses not to. He waits until literally he's the last guy getting paraded before God, and God says, yeah, it's him. And only then does he say, yeah, I sinned. Why does he wait so long? Why, when he's given all of these opportunities, why, when he sees the consequences of his actions, does he not come forward? He chooses not to. He doesn't choose life. And so we have this result that he is killed and his family is killed. Consider this in contrast to Rahab. Rahab, as a part of the city of Jericho, was devoted to destruction, and yet she was rescued. She was saved. Rahab the Canaanite was treated as an Israelite. And yet here we have Achan, who is an Israelite, and yet because of his sin, because of the choices that he makes, he then is devoted to destruction like a Canaanite. And what that contrast tells me is that even until the last, Achan could have made the right decision. He could have come forward. He could have repented. He could have begged mercy, but he chose not to do that. He instead waits until there's nowhere left for him to hide. And I think the inclusion of his family, sometimes we find that troubling, but I think the inclusion of his children in the destruction indicates the complicitness of their sin. I don't think it's really possible that he could have collected these things and snuck them back into the tent and dug a hole and buried them without his children knowing what was going on. And so they haven't come forward either. They haven't spoken up. But either way, even if they didn't know about it, the consequences of his action include innocent people. Whether it's his family, whether they were innocent or not, whether it's the men who died in attacking Ai, the consequences of his sin bring in innocent people. But despite all of that, it's worth noting here that individual sin can encompass those around us. We are all responsible for our own choices before God, but our choices still have consequences both for us and for those around us. Even if Achan's children went along with his plan, it was still Achan that put them in that position. It was still him coming home with the goods that put them in the position to have to make this incorrect choice. And God help us if we ever try and reassure ourselves that our sin is just our own. That my sin is, it only affects me. This is my choice, it's my life, and it only affects me, and my actions have nothing to do with anyone else. They do. Our actions, our choices, our sin affects the people around us. Joshua's failures as a leader have consequences on the people. Achan's failure as an Israelite and as a father has consequences on his family and on his people. By taking these things for himself, Achan is both disobeying God and he is stealing from God. By taking these things devoted to destruction into his home, Achan then devoted his home to destruction. This is what the law says in Deuteronomy 7:26. Don't take these things into your home, lest your home be devoted to destruction. And that's what Achan did. Achan acted unfaithfully to God and to his people. He lied to them. By acting as though he had obeyed, he brought about the humiliation of Joshua as a leader, and he brought about the death of the 36 men who attacked and were killed. Being a part of the family of God in a deceiving way and continuing in sin doesn't just impact the individual. It brings consequences to the leadership. It brings consequences to the body. It damages the reputation of the church and God's people in the world. It brings the disdain of the world. The choices we make, whether life or death, have consequences for all the people around us. Our sin is not just our own. All right, here we go. Fast gear. In chapter 8, we see that God renews his relationship with Joshua and with the people. And in contrast to Jericho, he gives them very explicit military tactics about how now they are to conquer the city of Ai. And he actually uses their own humiliation and defeat to draw the warriors of Ai out into an ambush. And then Israel goes up and they destroy the city and all of its inhabitants. And so in 7 and 25, so all who fell that day, both men and women, were 12,000, all the people of Ai. For Joshua did not withdraw his hand with which he stretched out the javelin until he had devoted to destruction all the inhabitants of Ai. Israel took only the cattle and the spoil of that city as plunder for themselves, according to the word of Yahweh which he had commanded Joshua. So Joshua burned Ai and made it a heap forever, a desolation until this day. So notice that. Notice that. The city of Ai is not devoted to destruction. Not in the same way. They destroy the city, yes. But what is Israel allowed to do? They're allowed to take spoil. They're allowed to take the goods of Ai and take it for themselves. God allows them to do that this time. They don't take the silver, they don't take the gold, they don't take those things. They still go into the treasury of God. But consider now the futility of Achan's sin. He coveted what he was seeing in Jericho, though he had been told not to touch it. And if he had simply been patient and trusted in God, he could have taken from Ai what he so coveted in Jericho. And instead, he chooses death. He steals, he lies, and he brings the judgment of God on himself, his family, and his people. And so I ask you this morning, what is sin worth to you? This may seem like a ridiculous question for Christians, but I want you to think about this. What is sin worth to you? That thing that you covet, that person you dislike, your pride, your anger, your pleasure, all of these things that tempt us away from covenant relationship with God, what are they worth to you? Is a little bit of gold, some fancy clothes, some prestige, some wealth, some status, is that worth your life? And what about the lives of others? What about the lives of the people you love? What about your family? What about your church family? What about your people? Are these things worth that? And don't think that you can deceive your way into participating into the things devoted to destruction and then not bring that destruction down on yourself and onto the people around you. How many family trees, Christian family trees, have been broken because one person decided, well, I'm going to make this decision for myself, and then their children fall away, their children's children fall away, and what had been a strong Christian family ceases to exist. What is sin worth to us? Shouldn't be worth anything. Thank you for your attention this morning. It's worth not committing it, absolutely. I still finished before the bell. Wow. Kind of surprised. Thank you.